The winter did not arrive the way winters were supposed to. There was no slow warning, no gentle easing into cold mornings and brittle leaves. It came like a slammed. One night the valley slept under a sky that still remembered autumn, and by morning the world had hardened into something sharp and unforgiving. The temperature dropped so fast that even the oldest people in town said they had never felt anything like it. 40 below was not just a number, it was a condition, a presence, something that seeped into bone and thought alike. In a place like this, winter ruled everything. It decided who stayed comfortable, who struggled, and who didn't make it through it all. People prepared all year for it. Wood piles were measured like bank accounts. Coal sheds were locked, counted, guarded. Axes were sharpened weeks in advance. Every household followed the same rhythm because the cold punished anyone who tried to be different. That was why her cabin stood out so much. It sat at the edge of the valley, beyond the last line of tightly packed homes, where the road thinned and the trees pressed closer together. It wasn't large or impressive. No wide porch, no towering chimney, no signs of extra insulation or expensive materials. Just a modest structure, half swallowed by snowdrifts as the first storm settled in. People had noticed it months earlier, when she first moved in, and even then it sparked quiet conversations. Outsiders always did. She did talk much. She nodded politely, answered questions briefly, and kept to herself. No one ever saw deliveries of firewood. No wagon of coal rattled down the road toward her place. No sound of chopping echoed from her land in the fall, when everyone else was racing daylight to build their reserves. That alone made people uneasy. In this valley, preparation was not optional, it was a mortal duty. As the cold tightened its grip, that unease turned into open curiosity. On the first truly brutal morning, the frost was so thick it muted sound. Doors creaked differently. Even voices seemed to freeze midair. Smoke rose from every chimney in town, heavy and constant, the visual proof that homes were fighting back against the cold, except one, her cabin. As chimney stayed dark. At first, people assumed she was gone. Maybe she had left before winter fully arrived. That would make sense. Plenty of newcomers underestimated the valley, panicked at the first real freeze, and disappeared without much notice. But her cabin showed no signs of abandonment. The snow around it was disturbed. The path to the door was completely buried. Someone was still there. The laughter came next. She'll be knocking soon. Someone joked at the general store, rubbing their hands together near the stove. No wood, no coal one. Take long. Others nodded. It was said without cruelty, just certainty. Winter always won. Everyone learned that eventually. Days passed. The temperature dropped further. The cold stopped being dramatic and settled into something steady and relentless. It gnawed at houses, made nails groan and beams complain. Inside their homes, people burned fuel faster than planned. Wood piles shrank. Coal bins echoed hollow sooner than expected. Still, her chimney stayed cold. Someone mentioned it again, this time without laughing. Another person said they had driven past her place late at night and seen a faint glow inside, not flickering like firelight, but steady. That detail lingered uncomfortably. Firelight always danced. Anything steady meant something else. By the end of the week, the mood in town had shifted. Jokes died out. Conversations lowered in volume when her cabin was mentioned. Curiosity blended with concern, and concern edged toward disbelief. 40 below was not survivable without heat. Not here. Not for long. People started watching without admitting they were watching. In the mornings, as they stepped outside to shovel snow or check traps, their eyes drifted toward the edge of the valley. No smoke. Ever. At night, when the wind howled so loudly it felt like the world was tearing itself apart, some wondered how anyone could sleep through it without a fire burning close. She did not come asking for help. That, more than anything, unsettled them. By the time the first real storm hit, a storm so fierce it erased the horizon and turned familiar landmarks into vague shapes, concern hardened into something sharper. Snow piled up faster than anyone could clear it. Wind cut through layers like knives. Even inside well-heated homes, people felt small and fragile. During that storm, someone swore they saw movement near her cabin. A door opening, a figure stepping out and then back in. It sounded impossible, and yet no one laughed when it was mentioned. No one wanted to imagine what it meant if it was true. When the storm finally passed, the valley emerged into a silence so deep it rang. Trees stood frozen mid-sway, their branches coated in ice. The air itself seemed brittle. People stepped outside cautiously, as if the ground might crack beneath them. That was when the footprints were noticed. They led away from her cabin, clear and deliberate, pressed deep into the snow. Fresh. Too fresh. The sight of them made stomachs tighten. Walking outside in that cold was dangerous even for short distances. Doing it without visible heat or preparation bordered on madness. And yet there they were proof that she had been alive, moving, surviving. No one said it out loud at first, but the thought passed from person to person all the same. Something was to right. Winter had always followed rules here. Everyone knew them. You burned fuel or you froze. You prepared or you paid for it. But her cabin, quiet and unchanged, sat at the edge of the valley like a question no one could answer. And, for the first time since the cold arrived, the neighbors weren't. Sure winter was the most dangerous thing among them. The footprints did not disappear as quickly as people expected them to. Even as wind swept across the valley and fresh snow fell in thin, bitter sheets, the impressions lingered just long enough to be seen again and again by different eyes. Each person who noticed them stopped for a moment longer than necessary, staring, measuring the distance between steps, the direction they led. They were not the shallow, frantic marks of someone running for shelter. They were calm, evenly spaced, purposeful. That detail unsettled people more than the footprints themselves. In the days that followed, winter settled deeper into the land. The cold stopped feeling like an event and became the background of existence. Wood stoves burned day and night. Coal was shoveled carefully, rationed with the same seriousness people once reserved for food. Inside homes, families slept in layers, hats pulled low, blankets stacked until breathing felt damp and heavy. No one wasted heat anymore. Doors opened quickly and closed faster. Windows stayed sealed, even when frost crept across the glass so thick it blocked the light. Conversations shifted. They no longer revolved around weather forecasts or chores, but around consumption. How much wood was left? How fast the coal was disappearing? Who might need help before the end of winter arrived? Survival had a way of sharpening awareness like that. And still, her cabin showed no sign of strain. Someone mentioned it at the store again, quietly this time, as if saying it too loudly might invite bad luck. Another person admitted they had driven past at dusk and seen light in her window steady, unmoving. Not the restless glow of flame. The words hung in the air, unanswered. No one challenged them. No one explained them either. At night, the wind howled through the valley like something alive, clawing at walls, searching for weaknesses. Even thick timber groaned under its pressure. People woke to the sound of their own houses shifting, beams tightening against cold so extreme it made wood brittle. In those moments, lying awake and listening, more than one person found their thoughts drifting toward the edge of the valley. How was she sleeping through this? The idea that she might have hidden fuel crossed everyone's mind. Maybe she had stored coal underground. Maybe she had stockpiled wood in secret. That explanation was comforting, familiar. It fit the rules they understood. But it did, to last long under scrutiny. Fuel left traces, smoke told stories. Axes left marks, wagons left tracks. None of those things existed around her place. As the days passed, concern slowly replaced curiosity. This was no longer about pride or being right. This was about the possibility that someone was in danger. In a place like this, ignoring that possibility was unforgivable. Even the people who had laughed earlier began to feel a weight settle in their chests. If she was struggling, if she was stubbornly refusing help, the cold would not care. A small group gathered one afternoon, pretending the meeting was accidental. They stood near the road, collars turned up, breath clouding the air. No one wanted to be the first to say it. "We should check on her," someone finally muttered. The words felt heavier than expected. Another person nodded slowly, just to make sure. They all agreed it was the right thing to do, but no one moved immediately. Something about the situation made hesitation feel wise. There was an unspoken sense that stepping toward her cabin meant crossing a line not of property, but of understanding. The walk out to her place felt longer than it should have. Snow creaked under boots with a sharp, hollow sound. The trees stood silent, their branches bowed under ice, like witnesses refusing to speak. As they got closer, the cabin came into view unchanged. No smoke, no sign of distress. Just stillness. They expected the door to be frozen shut. It was tea. That alone sent a ripple of unease through the group. One of them knocked, hard enough to be heard over the wind. The sound felt wrong in the quiet. For a moment there was nothing. Then the door opened. She stood there wrapped in simple layers, her face calm, eyes clear. She did not look like someone on the edge of freezing. She did not look relieved to see them. She looked normal. "Is everything all right?" someone asked, the question tumbling out awkwardly. She studied their faces for a moment, as if measuring their intentions. Then she nodded, yes. The warmth hit them as soon as they stepped inside. It wasn't tea dramatic. It did tea rush at them, like standing too close to a stove. It was subtle, steady, the kind of warmth that did. Tea announced itself until you realized your shoulders had relaxed, your jaw unclenched. The air was cold enough to remind you it was winter, but not cold enough to hurt. They stood there, stunned, stamping snow from their boots out of habit more than necessity. Their eyes searched instinctively for the source, a stove, a furnace, a hidden fire somewhere. There was nothing, no flames, no glowing metal, no sound of burning. The cabin was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Someone cleared their throat. You, Dawn, have a fire going?" She shook her head. The silence that followed was thick. One of them glanced at the walls, then the ceiling, then finally down at the floor. It was an unconscious movement, a last attempt to make sense of the impossible. He crouched, pressed his gloved hand to the wood, and froze. He pulled the glove off and touched it again. Warm. Not warm like sunlight on skin, but warm like something alive beneath it. Something patient and enduring. He looked up slowly, his expression pale. The others knelt, touched the floor, pressed palms flat, as if the answer might reveal itself through skin. Every face reflected the same disbelief. She watched them quietly. They asked questions then, too many, all at once. How long had it been like this? What fuel did she use? Was there something burning underneath? She raised a hand gently, and the questions stopped. "You came because you were worried," she said. "That's fair." She did not explain further. Not yet. Outside, the wind continued to cut across the valley, merciless and unchanging. Inside her cabin, warmth rose silently from below, ignoring the rules everyone else had lived by. By the time they stepped back out into the cold, their understanding of winter and of what was possible within it had already begun to fracture. They stood there longer than anyone meant to. No one wanted to be the first to speak again, as if words might break whatever fragile logic still held the moment together. The cabin felt wrong in a way that was difficult to name, not threatening, not eerie, but unsettling because it contradicted everything they knew. Winter was supposed to be loud inside a house, the pop of wood in a stove, the hiss of coal, the restless shifting of heat and flame. Here, there was only quiet. The warmth did not pulse or fade. It simply existed. One of the men straightened slowly, rubbing his hands together, even though they no longer burned with cold. "It does make sense," he said, more to himself than to her. She gave a small nod, as if she had heard that sentence many times before. "Most things don't, until you stop insisting they should look familiar." That answer only deepened their confusion. They began to move around the cabin, careful at first, like guests afraid of offending. The space was modest but thoughtfully arranged. No excess, no clutter. The walls were thick, the windows smaller than most, sealed tight. But those details alone could not explain this. Even the best-built homes in the valley struggled to stay warm in temperatures like these. Someone knelt again and pressed an ear to the floor, half expecting to hear fire roaring underneath. There was nothing, just a faint, steady hum that might have been imagination or might not have been sound at all, but sensation. "Is there something under here?" a woman asked, her voice low. "Yes," she replied simply. That single word landed with more weight than a long explanation might have. It invited questions without answering them. They looked at one another, then back at her, silently agreeing that whatever lay beneath the floor was the heart of this mystery. She walked to one corner of the cabin and lifted a small woven rug. Beneath it, a section of floor looked slightly different, older, darker. She knelt and slid a wooden latch aside, revealing a narrow opening between the boards. Heat poured up through it, unmistakable now. One of the men swore softly under his breath. She did not rush. She let them see, let them feel. Then she closed it again, replacing the rug as carefully as if she were tucking something in. "You dug under your cabin?" someone asked. "Before I built it," she corrected. "Much deeper than most people would bother with." They tried to picture it digging into frozen ground, carving space beneath where a home would someday stand. It sounded exhausting, pointless, even. Everyone here built against winter, not into the earth. Foundations were shallow, meant to hold weight, not harvest warmth. But why? Another voice asked. Why go to all that trouble? She leaned against the table, folding her arms loosely. "Because fire is loud," she said, "and it runs out." That struck something raw. They all knew what it meant to watch supplies dwindle, to calculate days of heat left like rations in a siege. Fire demanded constant attention. Miss a delivery, fall ill, break an arm in winter would take advantage without hesitation. "The ground does need feeding," she continued. "It just needs understanding." They wanted more than that. They wanted diagrams, explanations, proof. But she offered none. Not yet. Instead, she poured water from a kettle that had been resting on the table. Steam rose as she tipped it into cups. Someone could help themselves. "There's no fire under that either, is there?" She smiled faintly. No. They wrapped their hands round the cups, feeling heat sink into fingers numbed by weeks of cold. The simplicity of it made the situation feel even stranger. No elaborate machinery, no roaring furnace. Just warmth, steady and silent, rising from below. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the door, reminding them where they were. The contrast was sharp enough to make one person laugh ashort. disbelieving sound. "We've been freezing ourselves half to death," he said. "And you've been living like this the whole time." She did not gloat. She did not even look pleased. "I've been comfortable," she said. "There is a difference." They stayed longer than intended, asking questions that circled the truth without quite touching it. How long had it taken? Years. Was it dangerous? Only if rushed. Could it fail? Anything could if neglected. Eventually the cold outside began to call them back. Responsibilities waited. Fires needed tending. Supplies needed counting. As they pulled on gloves and stepped toward the door, one of them hesitated. "Why did? To tell anyone?" he asked. She considered that. "Because no one asked," she said gently, "and because people don to listen when they are certain they already know how something works." The door closed behind them with a soft finality. The walk back felt different. The cold hit harder after warmth, biting deep into cheeks and lungs. But it wasn't just the temperature that unsettled them. It was the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The valley looked the same snowbound, quiet, enduring, but their understanding of it no longer fit as neatly. Word spread quickly, though not loudly. People talked in kitchens and barns, leaning close to stoves as if heat itself might overhear. Some dismissed the story as exaggeration. Warm floors. No fire? Impossible. Others listened more carefully, asking the same questions again and again, trying to extract logic from rumor. By nightfall, the valley buzzed with a low, uneasy energy. Fires burned brighter than usual, fed more aggressively, as if people were trying to prove something to themselves. But the image lingered, unshakable, a cabin with no smoke, no fuel, no fear of 40 below. And beneath it all, the earth warm, patient, and waiting. By morning, the valley no longer felt like it belonged entirely to winter. The cold was still there, brutal, absolute. But something else had crept in alongside it. Unease. Curiosity sharpened into hunger. The people who had visited her cabin the day before carried the experience with them like heat trapped beneath clothing, impossible to ignore and impossible to explain away. They tried, of course. At breakfast tables they spoke carefully. They softened details. Warm, they said, not hot. Strange, maybe, but probably exaggerated by contrast. Someone suggested she had a hidden stove under the floorboards, cleverly concealed. Another insisted it must be stored coal, burned slowly, invisibly vented. Each explanation sounded reasonable for a few seconds until it did, because none of them could forget the silence. Fire always made itself known. Even the best stoves spoke in small ways, ticking metal, shifting air, the faint smell of smoke that clung to clothes and hair. Her cabin had none of it. Just warmth, rising evenly, like the earth itself was breathing. By midday, more people were heading toward the edge of the valley, pretending they had errands that took them that way. They slowed as they passed her place, glancing at the chimney, at the windows, at the snow around the foundation. No soot, no ash, no sign of effort. Eventually, a second group gathered, larger this time. They did ask permission so much as announce concern, their voices polite but firm. Winter was not a season that allowed much privacy. Survival made neighbors of everyone, whether they liked it or not. She opened the door again, just as calmly as before. Inside, the reaction was immediate and universal. Shoulders dropped, hands unclenched. Someone exhaled a laugh before realizing they hadn't. Tea meant to. The warmth wrapped around them quietly, without demand or drama. A few people exchanged looks that said the same thing. This one's tea luck. Someone spoke the thought aloud. "You are not burning anything, are you?" "No," she said. That single word had begun to sound dangerous. They spread through the cabin more freely now, less like guests and more like investigators. Not out of hostility, but necessity. In this valley, knowledge meant survival. Anything that defied winter demanded understanding, not adoration. One of the older men tapped the floor with his boot, listening. The sound was dull, solid. He frowned, then stomped harder. Nothing hollow, no echo, no hint of a void beneath. "This isn't right," he muttered. She watched, without interfering. Finally, someone did what no one had dared the day before. He knelt near the wall and pried at a plank where the wood met the stone foundation. It resisted at first, then lifted with a dry creak that cut through the quiet. A breath of warmer air rushed up immediately, unmistakable. Everyone froze. He lifted the plank fully, exposing what lay beneath. Not dirt, not rot. Stone. Dark, smooth stone, fitted together with care, its surface radiating heat like a slow-burning coal that never dimmed. The warmth rolled upward in waves, subtle but powerful enough to make skin tingle. A woman pressed her hand closer and pulled it back instinctively, startled. "It's warm all the way through," she whispered. "Not just the surface." They removed another plank. Then another. The pattern became clear, stone laid in channels, spaced deliberately, forming a network beneath the floor. No ash. No scorch marks. No sign of combustion. Just heat, steady and constant. Someone sat back on their heels, stunned. This shouldn't work. She knelt beside them, then her movements unhurried. It does work, she said. It cooperates. They looked at her sharply. She rested her palm on the stone, as comfortably as someone might rest it near a hearth. The ground here has always been warmer than people realize. Most of that warmth stays buried because no one asks it to do anything else. Questions poured out again, louder now, overlapping. How deep did it go? Was it safe? Had it ever failed? Could it collapse? Was it legal? That last one came from someone who already knew the answer did matter. She waited until the noise burned itself out. I did invent heat, she said. I just stopped wasting it. She explained slowly, choosing words with care, as if translating something old into a newer language. Long before the cabin existed, she had studied the land. Not maps or surveys, but the way frost settled, the way snow melted unevenly in spring, the places where ice never seemed as thick. She dug test holes, deep ones, even when people laughed. She learned where the ground held warmth and where it bled it away. Most people built fast, racing winter. She built patiently, racing ignorance. The stone beneath the floor ones, decorative. It was functional, shaped to absorb heat from deeper layers and spread it evenly across the cabin. No fire to flare, no fuel to run out, just a slow exchange between earth and home. Someone shook their head in disbelief. If this were possible, we'd all be doing it. She met his eyes. You could have, she said gently, but you were busy stacking wood. That stung more than she intended, and she knew it. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Outside, the wind rattled the walls, as if offended by what it could not touch. Inside, warmth continued its quiet work, indifferent to doubt. They replaced the planks carefully, suddenly reverent, as though they had glimpsed something private. No one wanted to damage what they did. Yet understand. By the time they stepped back into the cold, the valley felt different. The same snow, the same trees. But beneath it all, something had shifted. Winter was still ruthless, but it was no longer unquestioned. That night, fires burned as usual, but conversations burned hotter. Some people scoffed, clinging to familiar explanations. Others listened in silence, imagining stone beneath their own floors, imagining a winter without panic. And somewhere at the edge of the valley, her cabin rested quietly, its floor warm, the earth doing what it had always done, only now. Someone was finally paying attention. By the time the sun slipped behind the ridge that evening, the valley was buzzing in a way it hadn't, since the first settlers arrived generations ago. Winter still owned the land. Nothing had changed about the cold, but something had cracked in people's certainty. The rules they had lived by all their lives had been bent, quietly and without permission, by a single cabin with a warm floor and no fire. That unsettled them more than the temperature ever could. Inside their homes, people fed their stoves harder than necessary, shoveling in wood and coal with an almost defiant urgency. Flames roared, metal popped, smoke thickened in the air, above the rooftops. It was as if everyone was trying to prove that fire still mattered, that it was still the only answer. But the image refused to leave their minds. Stone beneath wood, warmth rising without flame. Silence where crackling should have been. Conversations stretched late into the night. Neighbors leaned close to one another, voices lowered even inside their own kitchens, as though winter itself might be listening. Some argued that what she built had to be dangerous. Heat from the ground could shift, they said. Stone could crack. The earth could collapse. Others claimed it was nothing new, that old civilizations had used similar methods long ago, though no one could quite remember where they heard that. And then there were those who said nothing at all, staring into their fires as if seeing something else beneath the flames. She slept soundly that night. While wind battered the valley and ice crept deeper into every exposed corner, her cabin remained steady. The warmth beneath the floor did not surge or fade. It held, patient and reliable, as it had for weeks already. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and stood barefoot on the wooden planks, feeling heat press gently into her soles. It grounded her, reminded her why she had chosen this path when others had laughed. She had not meant to cause a stir. That was the part no one seemed to understand. She hadn't built her cabin to prove anyone wrong. She built it because she did trust noise. Fire demanded attention. Fire demanded fuel. Fire demanded obedience. The ground asked only to be understood. By morning the questions began. A man arrived first, just after sunrise, his face red from cold and uncertainty. He stood awkwardly on her step, hat clutched in both hands. "I am not here to argue," he said before she could speak. I want to understand." She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside and let him in. Others followed, not all at once, but steadily. Some came openly, knocking on the door. Others lingered nearby until someone else went first, then joined as if by accident. Each reaction was the same: the pause at the threshold, the slow realization as warmth seeped into stiff joints, the involuntary breath released as bodies relaxed against their will. They asked better questions now. How deep did the stone channels go? How did she stop moisture from becoming a problem? What happened during spring thaw? Did the heat ever become too much? She answered what she could, honestly, without embellishment. Some things, she explained, required seeing the land differently, not just copying measurements. You can just dig anywhere, she told them. The ground isn't the same everywhere. You have to listen to it. That answer frustrated some and intrigued others. It wasn't a formula they could write down. It was an approach, a way of paying attention most people had forgotten. Not everyone approved. By midday, a different kind of visitor arrived, one who stood stiffly inside her cabin, arms crossed, eyes scanning with suspicion rather than wonder. He asked about permits, about safety, about what would happen if everyone started digging beneath their homes. His concern was practical, but his tone carried something else: fear of losing control. She listened patiently. If everyone dug without understanding, she said, that would be a problem. But that is true of anything. Fire burns houses down every year. We still use it. He left unconvinced, but quieter than he'd arrived. Outside, the cold deepened again, as if offended by the attention being diverted away from it. The temperature dipped even lower overnight. Wood supplies shrank faster. Coal bins showed bare patches at the bottom. For the first time in years, people began to wonder not if winter would be harsh, but if they had prepared enough. That was when the tone changed. The next group that came to her cabin did ask if it worked. They asked if it could be shared. The question hung between them, heavy and hopeful. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she led them to the corner of the cabin and lifted the rug again, opening the small access panel. Warmth spilled upward, fogging the cold air instantly. This isn't something you rush, she said, and it isn't something you build in fear. If you try to copy it just because you were panicking now, you will get hurt. They nodded, understanding more than they wanted to admit. What I can do, she continued, is show you how to read the land. The rest takes time. That wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the one they needed. Over the following days, the valley changed in subtle ways. People began paying attention to details they ignored all their lives. They noticed where snow melted first along certain slopes, where frost never seemed as thick near particular outcroppings, where the ground felt strangely softer beneath boots, even in the dead of winter. They also noticed how quickly fire consumed their resources. One evening, as another storm gathered strength, a family ran out of coal entirely. Their woodpile was low, damp, and insufficient. Without discussion, neighbors stepped in, sharing what they could, but the fear lingered. This winter wasn't done yet. And generosity, while powerful, was not infinite. More eyes turned toward the edge of the valley, not with resentment anymore, with something closer to respect. She began walking the land with small groups, showing them what she had once studied alone. She pointed out subtle rises, shifts in vegetation, places where ice behaved differently. She taught them to stop thinking of the ground as dead. Winter isn't the enemy, she said more than once. It is just honest. Some listened deeply, others nodded without fully understanding. But even that was a beginning. At night, as she returned to her cabin and closed the door against the howling wind, she felt the warmth beneath her feet and knew that something larger than survival was taking shape. The valley had always endured winter. That was nothing new. What was new was the idea that enduring did. To have to mean suffering. And as the cold pressed harder, as fires burned faster and supplies dwindled, the idea spread quietly like heat through stone patient, unstoppable and impossible to ignore. The first real test came not with curiosity, but with desperation. It arrived on a night so cold that sound itself seemed to freeze. The valley lay under a sky stripped clean of clouds, stars sharp and merciless, radiating no comfort at all. The temperature plunged without warning, far past what anyone had prepared for. Wood cracked in the forest like rifle shots. Even inside their homes, people woke to the feeling that something was wrong, that the cold had crossed a line. In one house near the center of the valley, a stove went out. It wasn't too dramatic. There was no explosion, no firestorm, just a quiet failure. A warped piece of metal, stressed by weeks of constant heat, finally gave way. The fire died quickly after that, starved of airflow. By the time the family noticed, the room had already begun to cool. They tried everything. They coaxed embers that refused to revive. They piled on wood that smoked uselessly. They wrapped pipes in cloth, layered blankets, breathed into their hands until fingers ached. but the cold moved faster than panic. Frost crept along the walls like a living thing. By the time they made the decision to leave, the air inside their home burned worse than the wind outside. They did knock on every door. They went to the one place they knew would be warm. The sound of pounding carried through the quiet valley, sharp and urgent. She woke instantly, already pulling on a sweater before the second knock landed. When she opened the door, the cold rushed in violently, but so did the people, half frozen, eyes wide, breath ragged. She did ask questions. She stepped aside. They collapsed onto chairs, onto the floor, onto each other. Children cried at first, then slowly quieted as warmth returned to numb skin. Someone laughed shakily, unable to stop. Someone else sat with their head in their hands, shoulders trembling. She moved through the cabin silently, bringing water, blankets, extra socks. The warmth beneath the floor worked steadily, undoing damage inch by inch. Color returned to cheeks. Breathing slow, panic loosened its grip. No one spoke for a long time. When they finally did, the words came out tangled and raw. Apologies, gratitude, fear, confessions of how close they come to losing more than comfort. She listened without interrupting, without judgment. Winter had already done enough judging for everyone. By morning, the story had spread, not as rumor this time, as fact. A family would have frozen if not for her cabin. That changed everything. People stopped debating whether what she had built was impressive or clever. They started asking how many people it could hold, how long it could sustain warmth if more came. What would happen if the cold got worse? The valley woke into a strange new rhythm. Fires still burned, but they were no longer the only plan. People moved differently, watched the sky differently. Winter no longer felt like something to endure alone. She felt the weight of that shift immediately. Her cabin was never meant to be a refuge for dozens. It was designed for one, maybe two. The heat beneath the floor was generous, but not infinite. Stone held warmth well, but even patience had limits. She gathered people that afternoon and spoke plainly. "This works because it is balanced," she said. "The ground gives heat slowly. If you demand too much too fast, you break the system." Some nodded, chastened. Others looked frightened. "So what do we do?" Someone asked. She thought of the years she had spent alone, studying, digging, failing, learning. She thought of how long it had taken her to trust the land instead of fighting it. And she realized that winter had forced her hand sooner than she planned. "We start now," she said. "Not by copying my cabin, by understanding why it works." She took them out into the cold, despite protests, leading small groups across the valley. She showed them places where snow thinned, no matter how low the temperature dropped, where steam sometimes rose faintly from cracks in stone at dawn, where the ground resisted freezing longer than it should. "This valley sits on old warmth," she explained. "Deep, slow warmth. Most of it never reaches the surface, but it can." They asked how she knew where to dig. "I listened," she said. "For years." That answer frustrated many. They wanted certainty, measurements, blueprints. Something they could rush before winter tightened further. But winter had already taught them the cost of rushing. As days passed, the cold deepened again. More stoves failed. More supplies dwindled. Each failure drove people closer not just to her cabin, but to each other. Families rotated shelter during the worst nights. Heat was shared like food once had been. Her cabin became a quiet anchor. Not loud, not central, but constant. People came not only for warmth, but for reassurance that winter had not yet won. She felt exhaustion settle into her bones. Not physical exhaustion, she was warm, rested, steady, but something heavier. Responsibility. She had never asked to lead. She had simply refused to freeze. Now the valley looked to her not as a curiosity, but as an answer. One night, long after others had gone, she sat alone on the floor, palms flat against the wood, feeling the heat rise. She thought of the stone channels beneath, the careful balance she had built. She thought of how easily it could all be damaged if misunderstood. And she thought of something else too, how much heat was being wasted every night, roaring uselessly up chimneys across the valley, while the ground below them waited, patient and ignored. By the end of that week, digging began. Not recklessly, not everywhere, but carefully, guided by what she showed them. Small test holes first. Shallow explorations. People worked slowly, despite the cold, learning to read subtle differences in soil and stone. Failures happened. Collapses. Water seepage. Lessons learned the hard way. She corrected when needed, warned when necessary, stepped back when people had to learn for themselves. The valley had crossed a point of no return. Winter still ruled the surface, but beneath it, change had begun. And the cold, for the first time in memory, was no longer the only thing shaping how people lived. The digging changed the valley in ways no one had anticipated. At first, it was tentative small groups working in shifts, hands stiff inside gloves, breath fogging the air, shovels bit cautiously into frozen ground. People were afraid of making mistakes, afraid of collapsing something unseen, afraid of wasting precious energy on an idea that might fail them when they needed it most. Winter does that to people. It turns every choice into a risk calculation. But something unexpected happened once the digging began. The fear softened. There was a strange comfort in working downward instead of constantly fighting outward. For months, everyone had been battling winter cutting wood, hauling coal, feeding fires that demanded endless attention. Digging was different. It was quiet, focused, purposeful. Each inch of soil removed felt like progress instead of defense. She moved among them without urgency, offering guidance but not control. She showed them how to recognize stone that carried warmth versus stone that merely held cold. How to feel subtle temperature differences through gloves. How to pause and listen when the ground resisted instead of forcing it. Pushing harder does make it faster, she reminded them. It just makes it fragile. They learned that lesson quickly. In one spot near the northern slope, a group rushed. They dug too shallow, too wide, and the ceiling collapsed inward with a muffled roar. No one was hurt, but the sudden loss of effort left them shaken. The ground did not punish recklessness loudly, it simply erased it. They rebuilt more carefully after that. Word spread beyond the valley. Travelers passing through noticed fewer plumes of smoke rising into the sky. They heard strange stories at waypoints and in-stories about warm floors, silent heat, cabins that did not burn fuel at all. Some laughed. Others listened. A few stayed. The cold, meanwhile, showed no mercy. Another storm swept through, heavier than the last. Snow fell sideways, driven by wind that cut visibility to nothing. The temperature dropped again, hovering at a level that felt unreal, even to those who had lived there their whole lives. Trees split under the strain. Animals vanished deeper into the forest, abandoning familiar trails. Inside the valley, fires still burned, but differently now. Lower, slower, more cautiously. People had begun saving fuel instinctively, no longer throwing it into the stove just to feel powerful against the cold. They had seen what happened when power ran out. During the worst nights, families rotated between homes that held heat better, and her cabin remained the last refuge. It was never loud or crowded. People entered quietly, spoke softly, and left as soon as they could manage on their own again. There was an unspoken agreement not to overwhelm what kept them alive. She watched all of this with mixed emotions. Pride never came into it. What she felt was closer to vigilance. Every new hole dug, every stone placed carried consequences. She knew how easy it was to misunderstand the ground, to mistake one warm pocket for another, to assume consistency where none existed. Still, she could not deny the change taking place. The valley was learning patience. One evening, after a long day of walking sights and answering questions, she stood outside her cabin and looked across the snow-covered land. Small lanterns glowed in the distance where people worked late, careful not to waste daylight. The wind carried sounds strangely, murmurs, laughter, the scrape of shovel on stone. It reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten: community. Winter had always driven people inward, isolating them behind thick walls and burning fires. Now, paradoxically, it was drawing them together. Knowledge was being shared instead of hoarded. Mistakes were discussed openly instead of hidden. People began to understand that survival was an individual achievement, but a collective one. Not everyone embraced it. There were still those who refused to dig, who clung fiercely to tradition. They burned through their supplies faster than others, insisting that fire had always been enough and always would be. Some of them mocked the quiet work happening across the valley, calling it foolish, dangerous, unnatural. She did not argue with them. Winter would do that soon enough. By mid-season, the first of the new floors began to warm. It was dramatic. No one threw open doors or celebrated loudly. One morning a man stepped out of bed barefoot and stopped. He stood there for a long moment, uncertain. Then he knelt and pressed his hand to the floor, disbelief spreading slowly across his face. "Yes, warm," he whispered, as if afraid the ground might take it back if spoken too loudly. Others experienced it the same way: small discoveries, quiet realizations, a patch of floor that no longer bit through boots, a corner that stayed dry instead of icing over, a room that no longer needed constant feeding to remain livable. Not every attempt worked. Some places remained stubbornly cold, some warmed unevenly, some needed to be redone entirely, but enough succeeded to change the valley's mood. Hope crept in, not the fragile kind that shattered under pressure, but something steadier, something earned. She spent less time explaining and more time observing now. People were beginning to ask the right questions on their own. They no longer asked, "How do we copy your cabin?" They asked, "What did we miss here? And what does the ground tell us?" That shift mattered more than any single warm floor. One night, she was called urgently to the far edge of the valley. A digging site had hit something unexpected, a pocket of heat far stronger than anticipated. Steam rose where snow melted instantly. The workers were excited, reckless with discovery. She shut it down immediately. "This isn't a gift," she warned. "It is a warning." They stared at her, confused. "Too much heat is just as dangerous as too little," she said. "Balance is what keeps you alive." They sealed the pocket carefully, redirecting what they could, leaving the rest untouched. It was a hard lesson, but an important one. The ground was not an infinite solution. It was a partner, not a servant. As winter dragged on, the valley grew quieter. Not weaker, quieter. Less smoke. Fewer frantic trips for fuel. Fewer nights spent awake listening for the sound of a dying fire. The cold was still present, still sharp, but it had lost some of its power over people's minds. She noticed it most in how children played again, even in the snow, their laughter echoing briefly before being swallowed by the white. They returned indoors with pink cheeks and numb fingers, confident that warmth awaited them. That had never happened before. Late one evening, after a long day, someone asked her a question she hadn't heard yet. "What will happen when winter ends?" She paused. Most people thought of winter as something to survive until spring arrived. She thought of it as a teacher. "When the ground thaws," she said slowly, "you will see what you built more clearly. Some of it will fail. Some of it will last. That is how you will know what was done right." They nodded, thoughtful. She did not say what else she knew, that once people learned to live without constant fear of winter, they would never go back. That the valley was changing in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Winter still ruled the surface. Snow still fell. Wind still howled. But beneath it, the valley had learned a new language, one spoken in patience, stone, and quiet warmth, and it was no longer afraid to listen. Winter did not loosen its grip quickly. It rarely did. Even as the days lengthened by barely noticeable minutes and the sun climbed a fraction higher at noon, the cold held on with stubborn pride. Snow remained packed hard against buildings, and ice still rimmed the riverbanks like glass. But something in the valley had already shifted, and everyone could feel it. The nights were the clearest sign. Where once darkness had been filled with the restless sounds of survival stoves being fed, doors opening and closing, footsteps crunching urgently through snow, there was now a quieter rhythm. Fires burned lower. Some did burn at all. People slept deeper, waking less often to check embers or add fuel. The fear that had lived in their chests all winter had begun to ease. Her cabin was no longer the only one with warm floors. They were imperfect, these new attempts. Some warmed only in patches, others took longer than expected to respond, and a few never worked at all. But enough of them held steady to prove the idea once, a fluke. It was a way forward. She walked the valley often now, not as a teacher so much as a witness. People greeted her differently. There was less awe in their eyes, less suspicion, more familiarity, more gratitude, spoken and unspoken. She accepted it quietly, knowing the work itself mattered more than recognition. One afternoon she stood near the ridge overlooking the valley and watched thin threads of smoke rise lazily into the sky. Far fewer than before. The sight stirred something deep and complicated in her. Fire still had its place, it always would, but it was no longer the valley, only defense against winter. That felt like a kind of freedom. Spring announced itself subtly, not with warmth at first, but with sound. The distant drip of melting ice, the faint trickle of water beneath snow, the soft collapse of overburdened drifts sliding from rooftops. These were noises people once associated with damage and worry. Now they listened with cautious hope. The ground, too, revealed its verdict. As the upper layers thawed, some of the new structures failed exactly as she had warned they might. Stones shifted. Channels flooded. Heat patterns changed or vanished entirely. People groaned, cursed, and then after a moment got to work fixing what they could. They no longer treated failure as proof of foolishness. It was information. Other builds held. Those were studied carefully, measured, remembered. The valley began to talk not about surviving winter, but about preparing for the next one differently. She received fewer visitors as the cold retreated, not because people no longer needed her, but because they were learning to trust themselves. That, she realized, had been the goal all along. One evening, as snow finally began to soften into slush near her doorstep, she sat inside her cabin with the door open, letting the cool air mix with the warmth rising from the floor. The contrast felt gentle now, not threatening. She thought about the first days of winter, the laughter, the doubt, the certainty that had ruled the valley. Certainty had been the most dangerous thing of all. Someone stopped by an older woman who had lived in the valley her entire life. She stepped inside, smiled at the familiar warmth, and sat heavily in a chair. "I used to think winter was something you beat," she said after a while, "or something that beat you." She looked down at the floor, feeling the heat through the soles of her boots. "Turns out you can just live with it." The words felt like a benediction. When the snow finally broke apart and the ground showed through dark and wet and alive, the valley did not rush to forget the winter. That surprised her. In years past, people celebrated spring by pretending the cold had never happened. This time, they remembered. They marked what had worked and what hadn't. They talked about stone and depth and patience the way they once talked about wood and flame. Her cabin remained where it always had, quiet at the edge of the valley. It no longer stood as a mystery or a challenge. It stood as a reference point, a reminder that survival did. You have to be loud or desperate. When the last of the ice melted and the river swelled with new water, she walked out onto the land and felt the ground under her boots, cool now, no longer giving heat so freely. That was fine. It had done its work. Winter would return. It always did. But next time, the valley would be ready not with fear and frantic flames, but with understanding. And beneath their homes, beneath stone and soil, the earth would wait patiently, holding its warmth in reserve, ready to share it again with those willing to listen.